My children told me to stop calling them. They said they had their own lives and that I needed to stay on my own and handle my own problems. So I did exactly what they asked. I stopped calling them, and I called my lawyer instead. When they tried entering my house 3 weeks later expecting to find a broken old man, armed security escorted them out. But the eviction was not the worst part. The worst part was the horrifying truth I found hidden in the trunk of my eldest son's Porsche. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth and treated you like a burden. The smell of warm blackberries and butter crust filled the kitchen. It was the exact smell of the last 40 Thanksgivings. But today the scent only made the massive Pennsylvania estate feel completely empty. It had been 8 months since my wife Caroline passed away. 8 months of waking up to a cold bed. 8 months of silence bouncing off the high ceilings of the house I built for us with my own 2 hands. I was 73 years old, standing alone at the marble island, wiping flour off my hands onto an old apron. I had spent the entire morning baking her famous pie. I thought keeping the tradition alive would bring some warmth back into the walls. Caroline was the heart of this family. When she was alive, this house was full of noise, laughter, and grandchildren running through the halls. Without her, it was just wood stone and an echoing silence that threatened to swallow me whole. It was Thanksgiving Day, a day for family, a day to count your blessings. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My thumbs are thick, scarred from 40 years of pouring concrete and tying rebar, so manipulating the small screen is always a chore. I tapped the video call icon next to the name of my eldest son, Preston. He was a 45-year-old financial executive, now a man who prided himself on his expensive tastes and elite circles. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. I almost hung up thinking he was busy preparing a family dinner with his wife Monica and my grandchildren. But then the screen connected. Instead of the quiet warmth of a family living room, my phone exploded with the thumping bass of club music. Preston's face appeared on the screen. He was wearing a tailored linen suit that probably cost more than my first work truck. His face was flushed, his eyes a little glassy from expensive champagne. Behind him I could see the glaring sun and the sparkling ocean of the Hamptons. People were laughing, holding crystal glasses, completely ignoring the holiday tradition in favor of a lavish, loud party. I could see my younger son Derek in the background, holding a drink and laughing loudly, completely unbothered by the fact that his father was sitting alone 400 miles away. "Dad, what is it?" Preston practically shouted over the music. He did not say Happy Thanksgiving. He did not ask how I was doing on my first holiday without his mother. He just stared at the screen with an expression of pure, unfiltered annoyance. I swallowed the lump in my throat and tried to keep my voice steady. "I just wanted to see your faces," I said. "I baked your mother's blackberry pie. I was wondering what time you and Derek were planning to head down here. We talked about having dinner together. I even set the dining room table." Preston sighed loudly. He rolled his eyes, adjusting the phone so I could clearly see the irritation settling into his features. "Dad, stop calling us. We are exhausted. We have been dealing with corporate restructuring all month. Derek is dealing with his own mess after his latest startup failed. We have our own lives to live right now. You are in that massive house all by yourself, but you need to figure it out. Handle your own life. We cannot be babysitting you every time you feel sad." I stood there in my quiet kitchen, the heat from the oven warming my back, unable to comprehend the coldness in his voice. Babysitting. That was the word he used. But before I could even process the disrespect of his words, I heard another voice. It was his wife, Monica. She stepped into the frame holding a mimosa, her perfectly manicured nails resting casually on Preston's shoulder. She did not know the microphone was picking up her voice so clearly over the music. "Hang up the phone, Preston," she sneered, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "The old man's rambling is killing the vibe. Just tell him we are busy and cut the call." Preston did not correct her. He did not tell his wife to respect his grieving father. He did not defend the man who paid for the very life they were enjoying. He just looked back at the screen, gave a tight, fake smile, and said, "We will call you next week, Dad." The screen went black. The call ended. The silence crashed back down on me heavier and darker than before. I did not cry. At 73, you learn that tears are a waste of water when the problem requires concrete action. I placed the phone gently on the marble counter. I looked down at my hands. These hands were rough, battered, and permanently stained with the grit of manual labor. I started as a muddy boot contractor laying bricks in the freezing rain to build a company from the dirt up. I sacrificed my youth, my back, and my joints so Preston and his brother Derek could wear those designer suits. So they could attend Ivy League schools and live a life where they never had to know the feeling of calloused hands or a hungry stomach. I gave them everything unconditionally. I built the very foundation they were standing on only for them to use that height to look down at me like I was a piece of trash. The oven timer buzzed a sharp mechanical sound cutting through the dead quiet of the house. I walked over, grabbed the insulated mitts, and pulled out Caroline's blackberry pie. The fruit was bubbling, the crust was a perfect golden brown. It was a masterpiece of memory exactly the way she used to make it. I carried it over to the kitchen counter. I looked at it for a long, long time. The smell that was supposed to bring comfort now just smelled like a pathetic illusion, a desperate attempt to hold on to a family that no longer existed. I picked up the hot glass dish, walked over to the heavy stainless steel trash can, stepped on the pedal, and dropped the entire pie inside. The glass shattered against the bottom. The sweet dark fruit spilled over the garbage, ruined forever. Right then and there, something inside me clicked into a new gear. It was like watching a heavy steel beam snap into place. The grieving, lonely father who just wanted his boys to visit him died in that kitchen. The man who remained was the contractor. The man who knew how to spot a crack in a foundation before the whole house caved in. My sons did not just disrespect me. They looked at me as a nuisance, a burden that was ruining their lavish lifestyle. They thought I was just an old, soft fool sitting alone in a massive house waiting for them to throw me scraps of their time. They forgot who built the table they were eating from. I washed the flour off my hands, drying them slowly on a towel. The sadness was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. If they wanted me to handle my own life, I was going to handle it. I walked out of the kitchen, leaving the shattered pie in the trash, and headed straight for my study. The first stage of their betrayal had shown its face, and I was going to be ready for whatever came next. The silence in the kitchen felt heavier now. The roar of Preston's car faded down the long driveway, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the crisp, untouched legal document resting on the marble island. I stared at the signature line for a long time. My heart was beating with a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I needed a moment to process what had just happened. I needed to calm the adrenaline that was suddenly spiking through my veins. After 40 years of breathing in drywall dust and concrete powder, my preferred method of calming down was a good stiff drink or a strong cigar. I opted for the latter. I left the kitchen and walked slowly down the long hallway toward my private study. The hardwood floors creaked slightly under my boots. It was a familiar sound, a comfort I usually welcomed, but today every noise felt amplified. The house was too big for one person. Caroline used to say we needed the space for the grandchildren, but those grandchildren rarely visited anymore. The walls of the hallway were lined with photographs, happy moments frozen in time, graduations, family vacations, Caroline smiling brightly in her favorite yellow sundress. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead. I could not bear to look at her smile right now, not when our eldest son had just stood in our kitchen and tried to manipulate me with manufactured grief. I opened the heavy oak doors to my study. The room smelled of old paper leather polish and the faint lingering scent of my tobacco. It was my sanctuary. a place where I used to sit late at night reviewing blueprints and calculating profit margins while the rest of the world slept. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn back, letting in the pale, slanting light of the late afternoon winter sun. I walked over to the humidor resting on the corner of my mahogany desk, the very desk Preston had been eyeing with such unnatural hunger just minutes ago. I selected a cigar, snipped the end with a practiced motion, and struck a match. The smoke curled into the cold air, thick and bitter. I took a deep draw, holding the smoke in my lungs, hoping the familiar burn would steady my shaking hands. I stood in the center of the room, letting my eyes wander across the familiar space. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with structural engineering manuals and history books Caroline had bought for me over the decades. My gaze swept across the room and stopped abruptly on the far wall. There was a painting hanging there. It was a beautiful, moody seascape that Caroline had purchased during a trip to the coast of Maine for our 20th wedding anniversary. She loved the aggressive strokes of the waves crashing against the jagged rocks. I had hung it perfectly centered between two tall bookcases. As a master contractor, my eyes are trained to notice imperfections. I can spot a foundation that is off by a fraction of an inch. I can look at a framed wall and tell you if the studs are bowed. It is a curse and a blessing of the trade. My brain registers when things are not perfectly plumb level and square. And right now, my brain was screaming that the seascape was wrong. The heavy gilded frame was tilted downward on the right side. It was a minuscule shift, perhaps no more than a quarter of an inch, but it was glaring to me. I had not touched that painting in months. The cleaning staff had strict instructions never to dust the artwork for fear of damaging the frames. There was absolutely no reason for it to be crooked, unless someone had moved it. I set my cigar down in the heavy glass ashtray on my desk. The smoke continued to rise in a thin gray column as I walked slowly across the Persian rug toward the painting. My boots made no sound on the thick wool. I stopped in front of the seascape. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, covering the canvas. I looked like an old, tired man, but my eyes were sharp. I reached out with both hands and firmly gripped the edges of the gilded frame. I pulled it forward. The painting was mounted on heavy-duty, concealed steel hinges that I had installed myself. The frame swung outward smoothly, revealing a recessed cavity in the drywall. Inside that dark, hidden space sat a solid steel wall safe. It was a high-end, commercial-grade model, the kind I used to install in the private offices of my wealthiest clients. I looked at the digital keypad mounted on the heavy steel door. My breath caught in my throat. The small liquid crystal display, which normally showed a blank dark screen waiting for a numerical input, was illuminated. It was flashing a bright, aggressive red light. I leaned closer, squinting to read the digital text scrolling across the tiny screen. System locked. Too many failed attempts. The words felt like a physical blow to my chest. A cold, heavy stone dropped into my stomach. I knew exactly what that red flashing light meant. The security protocol on this specific model was rigorous. If someone entered the incorrect access code 5 consecutive times, the internal computer would trigger an automatic lockdown. The keypad would freeze, preventing any further entries for a full 24 hours. It was a fail-safe designed to thwart brute force break-ins. Someone had stood exactly where I was standing. Someone had swung the painting open, stared at the keypad, and desperately punched in numbers, guessing wildly, trying to force their way into the vault. 5 desperate failing attempts. There were only 3 people in the world who even knew this safe existed. Myself, the contractor, who helped me weld the reinforcement brackets into the wall studs a decade ago, and Preston. I had shown it to Preston years ago, back when I still believed he was the responsible, honorable son who would eventually manage the family estate when I passed on. I had told him about the safe, but I had never given him the code. I had told him the code was sealed in an envelope at my attorney's office to be opened only upon my death. My hands began to tremble, but this time it was not from grief or shock. It was from a rising, molten anger. I rested my forehead against the cool drywall next to the safe, closing my eyes. I knew exactly what was resting behind that solid steel door. There were no gold bars, no stacks of cash, no bearer bonds. Inside that safe sat a single thick manila envelope. Inside that envelope was Caroline's life insurance policy. It was a comprehensive plan we had taken out 30 years ago, specifically designed to secure the family's future. The payout was a flat $2 million. It was tax-free, immediate liquidity upon the presentation of a valid death certificate. The money had not been claimed. The insurance company had sent the claim forms months ago, but I had locked them in the safe alongside the policy. In order to process the claim, I had to formally submit Caroline's official death certificate. I had to look at that piece of paper stamped by the county, reducing her beautiful, vibrant life to a medical cause of death and a timestamp. I could not do it. I was not ready to legally finalize her absence. The money meant absolutely nothing to me without her, so I locked the paperwork away, intending to deal with it when my heart could bear it. Preston knew about the policy. He knew the exact dollar amount. He also knew I had not claimed it yet, because he had subtly asked about it twice since the funeral, masking his inquiries as concern for my financial well-being. The pieces of the puzzle began to slam together in my mind, forming a picture so ugly, so deeply disturbing, that it made my stomach churn. The timeline of today's events replayed in my head with terrifying clarity. Preston had not come here today to apologize. He had not driven all the way from the city to check on his grieving father. He had used his spare key to enter my home, while he assumed I was out running errands or sitting in the garden. He had marched straight into my private study. He had moved the painting and desperately tried to hack the keypad, probably guessing birth dates, anniversaries, and addresses, hoping to score the $2 million envelope. When the system locked him out, flashing that damning red light, he panicked. He could not get the physical documents. He could not force the safe open without heavy tools and making a massive racket. He needed a backup plan. He needed a way to legally bypass the steel door and gain direct control over my assets. So he closed the painting, walked into the kitchen, pulled out that pristine power of attorney document, and waited for me to walk inside. He played the role of the exhausted, caring son. He offered to take the burden of my finances off my shoulders, knowing full well that if I signed that paper, he could simply contact the insurance company himself as my legal proxy. He could request duplicate forms, submit the death certificate, and route the $2 million directly into an account he controlled. I opened my eyes and stared at the flashing red light. The systematic betrayal was breathtaking. He was not just disrespectful. He was completely predatory. He was trying to rob me blind while I was mourning his mother. I slowly pushed the heavy gilded frame back into place, making sure the seascape was perfectly level, hiding the flashing red light once more. I walked back to my desk, picked up my cigar, and took another long drag. The smoke tasted different now. The sadness was gone. I was a man standing in the middle of a battlefield, and the enemy was wearing my own face. I crushed the burning ember of my cigar into the heavy glass ashtray, watching the smoke fade. The revelation about the safe and the power of attorney burned away the last remnants of my grief-driven lethargy. I grabbed the keys to my heavy-duty Ford truck and stepped out into the crisp winter morning. The cold air hit my face sharp and biting. I climbed into the cab of my truck. This truck was a testament to 40 years of grueling work. The steering wheel was smooth from decades of my calloused hands gripping it, guiding tons of steel to job sites. I turned the ignition and the engine roared to life. I put the truck in gear and headed down the long gravel driveway toward town. My mind raced, piecing together the timeline of his deceit. I needed to see exactly how far Preston was willing to go. My first stop had to be the bank. The drive into town usually brought me a sense of peace. Today, the familiar streets looked like a blurry backdrop to the storm brewing inside my head. I pulled into the parking lot of the First National Bank branch, easing my truck into a spot near the front doors. I had been banking here since the 70s. They knew me. We had financed our first excavators through this very branch. I turned off the engine, gripped the door handle, and took a deep breath. I walked through the double glass doors. The bank was quiet, just the hum of teller machines. I walked toward the main counter, intending to ask for a complete printout of all my accounts to freeze everything. But before I could reach the line, I heard my name, Richard. The voice was hushed, urgent, and laced with an anxiety that immediately put me on high alert. I turned to see Martha standing by the doorway of her private office. She was a sharp, meticulous woman who had handled my company payrolls for over 25 years. She knew our family history inside and out. Right now, her face was pale, and she clutched a manila folder tightly against her chest. "Richard, please come in here for a moment," she said. I stepped inside, and she immediately closed the heavy wooden door behind me, twisting the wand to shut the horizontal blinds. It was a level of panic I had never seen from her. She gestured toward the chair opposite her desk. "Sit down. Let me get you water." I shook my head, remaining standing. "I do not need water, Martha. Tell me what is wrong. You look like you have seen a ghost." She took a shaky breath, placing the folder on her desk, but keeping her hand protectively over it. "Richard, I have to ask you a very delicate question. Are you feeling well? How is your memory? Have you been experiencing any severe confusion lately?" I stared at her, the cold edge of reality slicing through the room. "I am perfectly fine, Martha," I said, keeping my voice steady. "My mind is as sharp as it was 30 years ago when we negotiated my first commercial loan." "Why would you ask me something like that?" She let out a shuddering sigh of relief, leaning back in her chair. "Thank God," she whispered. "Because your son Preston was here last Thursday afternoon, and he painted a very different picture." She opened the folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. My eyes landed on the official letterhead of a high-end private medical clinic in the city. I picked up the paper and read the typed paragraphs. It was a formal medical evaluation bearing the signature of a doctor I had never met in my entire life. The document explicitly stated that I, Richard Gallagher, was exhibiting rapid, progressive signs of severe dementia. It claimed I was experiencing frequent bouts of disorientation, memory loss, and aggressive outbursts, and that I required immediate specialized care. The words burned into my retinas. They had manufactured a medical crisis. They were legally declaring me incompetent. I slowly placed the paper back on the desk. Martha leaned forward, her voice trembling with professional outrage. Preston came into my office, closed the door, and looked me right in the eye, she explained in a horrified whisper. He put on this incredible performance. He looked so devastated. He told me you were slipping away fast. He said you were forgetting Caroline was gone wandering the house at night, and that it was breaking his heart. Then he handed me that letter and requested an immediate wire transfer of $50,000 from your primary savings account. He said it was a non-refundable deposit required to secure a bed for you at an elite lockdown memory care facility. A memory care facility. An asylum. They were not just planning to steal my money. They were planning to legally kidnap me. They wanted to lock me away in a padded room where no one would listen to my protests. "And did you authorize the transfer, Martha?" I asked, stripping away all emotion to focus purely on the facts. She shook her head emphatically. "Absolutely not." I told him that regardless of the medical letter, I could not authorize a transfer of that magnitude without your direct in-person consent or a fully executed notarized power of attorney. He got very agitated when I refused. He tried to pull rank, but I held my ground. He finally stormed out, swearing he would be back this week with the finalized paperwork. The final puzzle piece snapped into place with a sickening thud. The power of attorney document. Preston had just slid across my kitchen island an hour ago, was not just a tool to bypass the locked safe in my study. It was the master key to my entire life. He needed my signature on that exact document to satisfy Martha, to bypass the bank security protocols, and to drain my accounts dry. He was going to use my own money to pay for the facility where he planned to lock me up. The sheer, calculated malice of the plan was staggering. He had a fake doctor ready, All he needed was my signature to complete his perfect checkmate. I looked at Martha, seeing the genuine fear and loyalty in her eyes. I reached across the desk and gently squeezed her hand. "You are a good friend, Martha. You saved my life today, and I will never forget it. I need you to flag every single account attached to my name. Personal, business, retirement, everything. Put a hard freeze on all outbound transfers. If Preston or Derek comes in here with a piece of paper bearing my signature, you reject it immediately and call the police." She nodded vigorously, her fingers flying across her keyboard to initiate the highest security protocols. "Consider it done, Richard. No one is touching a cent." I turned and walked straight out of her office. The time for gathering any clues was over. I pulled my phone from my pocket, bypassed my sons, and dialed Victor Sterling. Victor Caldwell was not the kind of lawyer you called when you wanted to draft a simple will or negotiate a business merger. Victor was a former Marine, a man who had traded his combat boots for a tailored suit, but he had never lost his battlefield mentality. He was ruthless, calculating, and easily the most feared estate litigator in the entire state of Pennsylvania. We had served together decades ago, and over the years he had helped me navigate the most treacherous waters of my commercial contracting business. If anyone knew how to dismantle an ambush, it was him. The line rang twice before his deep, gravelly voice answered. "Richard, it is the middle of the workday. To what do I owe the pleasure?" I gripped the heavy leather steering wheel so hard my knuckles audibly popped. "I need your professional help, Victor. I am dealing with a hostile takeover." His tone shifted instantly, the casual friendliness completely replaced by a sharp military precision. "A corporate issue or a personal one?" "Both," I said, my voice tight and strained. "Preston just tried to drain $50,000 from my personal accounts to put me in a memory care facility. He has a forged medical letter claiming I have severe dementia. He was at my house an hour ago trying to manipulate me into signing a broad power of attorney." There was a heavy, dead silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in his brilliant mind. "Where are you right now?" "Sitting in the parking lot of the First National Bank," I replied. "I just had the manager freeze every single asset attached to my name." "Good man," Victor said. "Do not go back to your house just yet. Drive straight out, to the county line. Meet me at the Rusted Diner on Route 9 in 45 minutes. Do not tell anyone where you are going. I am leaving my office right now." The diner on Route 9 was a relic from the 1970s, a dilapidated building made of faded chrome and cracked red vinyl booths. It was miles away from the polished city limits where Preston and his high society friends operated. I parked my old truck around the back near the kitchen dumpsters, completely out of sight from the main road. I walked slowly inside. The heavy diner, air smelled of stale coffee and fried grease. I found a booth in the darkest corner and ordered black coffee. 10 minutes later, Victor walked through the door. Even in his late 60s, he possessed a formidable, intimidating physical presence. He slid into the booth across from me, placing a sleek black leather briefcase on the scratched laminate table. He did not offer any small talk. "Show me what you have," he ordered. I slid the copy of the forged medical letter Martha had given me across the table. Victor picked it up, pulling a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses from his breast pocket. He read the document with alarming speed, his eyes darting back and forth across the page. His jaw tightened. When he finished, he dropped the paper on the table and let out a low, slow breath. "This is not just a power play, Richard. This is an execution," he said, looking me dead in the eye. "Do you know what a conservatorship is?" I shook my head slowly. "I have heard the term before, but I do not know the exact legal mechanics." Victor leaned forward, resting his thick forearms on the table. "It is a legal status strictly designed for people who can no longer care for themselves. If a judge grants a conservatorship, you lose every fundamental right you possess as an adult. You lose the right to manage your own money, the right to make medical decisions, and the right to choose where you live. Preston is meticulously building a paper trail to present to a judge. He wants to have you declared legally incompetent. Once that happens, he automatically becomes your conservator. He gets the keys to your entire kingdom. I stared into my black coffee, the dark liquid trembling gently, slightly as my hands shook. He tried to get me to sign a power of attorney this morning, I explained, recounting the tense moment in my kitchen. He said it was just to help with my property taxes and banking for 6 months. Victor nodded grimly. The power of attorney was his desperate shortcut. If you had signed that, he could have liquidated your assets and moved you into a facility without ever having to face a judge. But since you delayed, and since your bank manager blocked the cash withdrawal, he is going to realize his cowardly shortcut entirely failed. He will have to move to the main plan. He will file for a full conservatorship. The reality of the situation crashed over me like a concrete slab. My own flesh and blood. The boy I had taught to throw a baseball. The boy whose college tuition I paid for in full. He was actively plotting to strip away my humanity. He wanted to lock me in a clinical room surrounded by strangers with deteriorating minds simply because I was an obstacle to my own wealth. I want to confront him, I said, my voice vibrating with a very sudden, uncontrollable fury. I want to drive straight to his luxury office in the city, kick the doors in, and drag him out by the collar of his expensive suit. I want to look him in the eye and make him explain this absolute garbage. Victor reached across the table and firmly gripped my forearm, his grip like a steel vice. You will do absolutely nothing of the sort, Richard. You listen to me very carefully right now. If you confront them now, you will be giving them exactly what they need. What are you talking about? I demanded violently, pulling my arm back. Think about how it will look on paper, Victor explained. You barge into his office screaming and acting aggressively. He immediately calls the police. He shows the responding officers this forged medical letter stating you have severe dementia and are prone to aggressive, confused outbursts. The police will not see a betrayed father demanding justice. They will see a violent, confused elderly man who has lost his grip on reality. They will place you on an involuntary psychiatric hold. So what do we do instead? I asked, my voice dropping to a low, desperate, hoarse whisper. How do I fight an enemy who is using my own sanity as collateral? Victor took a sip of his coffee, his eyes narrowing with sharp, tactical brilliance. We play dumb, he stated flatly. We need undeniable proof of their malicious intent. We need something so damning that no judge will ever grant them control. You are going to act confused. You will become the perfect bait. We are going to rig your house with hidden cameras and wait for them to break in. I nodded slowly, a cold, determined smile finally spreading across my face, ready for this war. The clock on the hallway wall chimed twice, its deep brass tone echoing through the pitch-black corridors of my estate. It was exactly 2 a.m. I was sitting in the dark in the grand foyer, holding a lukewarm cup of black coffee, waiting for the arrival of Victor's people. True to his word, Victor had moved with military efficiency. He told me that fighting a phantom required phantom tactics, and tonight we were going to turn my sanctuary into a fortress of observation. I stared out the large bay window next to the heavy oak front door. The winter night was dead and still. The frost clinging to the barren branches of the oak trees sparkled faintly under the bright moonlight. Then a pair of headlights cut through the darkness at the bottom of the long driveway. The vehicle moved slowly without any sound of gravel crunching. A sleek, matte black van rolled to a stop just inches from the front porch steps. There were absolutely no glowing company logos on the side panels. It was completely unmarked and thoroughly discreet. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open before they had a chance to knock. 3 men dressed in dark work clothes stepped out of the van carrying reinforced cases. The man in the lead, a tall guy with a close-cropped beard, gave me a brief nod. "Mr. Gallagher," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Victor sent us. We are here to upgrade your security architecture." I stepped aside and motioned for them to enter. They moved into the foyer with a practiced silent efficiency that reminded me of the elite military contractors I used to hire for government builds decades ago. They opened their cases on the entryway rug, revealing layers of dense protective foam housing sophisticated, miniaturized electronics. I want complete coverage of the primary living spaces, I instructed them, keeping my voice low. The kitchen, the main hallways, and absolute focus on my private study. That is where the trap will be sprung. The lead technician nodded, pulling a tiny matte black lens from a static-proof bag. He held it up to the dim light. "This is military-grade optics, sir," he explained. "We will embed these into the existing infrastructure of the house. They operate on a closed, encrypted loop that streams directly to a secure server we will set up for you. They are entirely undetectable to standard sweeping devices. Your sons could sweep this room with a commercial bug detector, and they would find nothing." I watched them fan out across the house, moving like shadows. Two men headed straight for the kitchen, the exact place where Preston had stood, and fed me his lies about power of attorney, the exact place where I had thrown Caroline's blackberry pie into the trash. I followed them quietly and watched as they carefully dismantled the smoke detectors mounted on the ceiling. They spliced the micro cameras into the hardwired electrical lines of the alarms, ensuring the lenses had a perfect view. The lead technician accompanied me into the study. He immediately understood the focal point of the room. He examined the antique cherry wood desk, where Caroline kept her files, and then his gaze moved to the seascape painting covering the wall safe. He did not ask questions about what was behind the canvas. He just unlatched his tool belt and went to work. He carefully drilled a microscopic hole into the thick wooden spine of a massive bookshelf sitting directly opposite the safe. He embedded a lens so small it looked like a natural imperfection in the wood grain. He then moved to the antique desk, placing a secondary audio receiver beneath the heavy top drawer, ensuring it would pick up the faintest whisper. I stood by the heavy velvet curtains, watching the glow of their flashlights dart across the books and the furniture. A deep, heavy sorrow began to settle in my chest, mixing with the cold determination I had carried all day. I spent 40 years of my life building homes. I laid foundations, framed walls, and hoisted steel beams to create safe spaces where families could gather. I built structures meant to protect people from the freezing cold, the brutal storms, and the unpredictable dangers of the outside world. I poured my sweat and blood into the earth so mothers and fathers could raise their children in security and peace. And now, at 73 years old, I was rigging my own house. I was not fortifying this estate against strangers, burglars, or violent criminals. I was turning my home into a surveillance trap to protect myself from the very children I had raised, the boys I had taught to ride bicycles in the driveway, the sons I had sacrificed my youth to protect. I was installing spy equipment to catch my own flesh and blood, trying to destroy me. The contrast felt like a physical weight pressing down on my lungs. "Mr. Gallagher," the lead technician said, pulling me back from the edge of my memories. "We are ready to establish the command center." I led him upstairs to a small, unused guest bedroom at the far end of the hall. The technicians set up a sleek laptop on a folding table, connecting it to a heavy localized server box they had carried up from the van. The screen flickered to life, dividing into multiple high-definition grids. The clarity of the image was stunning. Even in the low light of the night, the infrared sensors rendered the rooms in sharp detail. I could see the marble island in the kitchen. I could see the exact position of the seascape painting in my study. I could see the antique desk waiting silently in the shadows. The technician handed me a small encrypted tablet. "This is synchronized with the server," he explained. "You can monitor the feeds from anywhere. The system is motion activated. The moment anyone crosses the threshold of these rooms, you will receive an immediate alert on this device. The audio is incredibly sensitive. You will hear every breath they take." I took the tablet, the cold metal resting heavily in my palm. The interface was clean and simple. I swiped my thumb across the screen, expanding the view of the study. The trap was perfectly laid. The bait was resting on the desk. The invisible net was pulled tight across the estate. I thanked the men, shaking the technician's hand before escorting them back to the unmarked van. I stood on the porch and watched the taillights disappear down the gravel driveway, fading into the dark night. The absolute silence of the property rushed back in, but it felt different now. The house was no longer an empty tomb of grief. It was a loaded weapon waiting for the trigger to be pulled. I walked back inside, locked the heavy front door, and climbed the stairs to the dark guest room. I sat in front of those glowing screens, my eyes locked on the empty study. The preparations were complete. Now I just had to send the signal. I pulled my phone from my pocket and stared at the bright digital screen. It was time to feed them the exact narrative they had so carefully constructed. I opened the family group text message. I typed slowly, intentionally, making a few minor spelling errors, and turning off the autocorrect feature to ensure my message looked like the fumbling efforts of an elderly man losing his grip on technology. I composed the message carefully. Kids. My memory has been a little foggy lately. I am feeling very overwhelmed and confused by everything since your mother passed away. I talked to the pastor, and I am going on a 3-day silent church retreat up in the mountains to clear my head and pray. There will be absolutely no cell phone service up there, so do not worry if you cannot reach me. Preston. I left those power of attorney papers sitting right on top of Caroline's antique desk in the study. I am just too tired to read them right now. I will sign them the moment I get back on Sunday evening. I love you, boys. I read the message twice before sending it. It was the perfect piece of bait. It validated their false narrative of my rapid mental decline. It gave them a specific guaranteed window of time where I would be completely unreachable and isolated. And most importantly, it told Preston exactly where the document was located, confirming that the house was empty and completely unguarded. I took a deep breath, steadied my trembling thumb, and pressed send. I placed the phone face up on the table next to the encrypted laptop and waited. I did not have to wait very long at all. Less than 5 minutes later, the screen illuminated with a new notification ping. It was a direct reply from Derek. He was the son who had a mountain of gambling debts and a bankrupt tech startup, the son who desperately needed a massive cash injection to keep his aggressive creditors at bay. His reply popped up on the bright screen. Have a blessed trip, Dad. Take all the time you need to rest and heal in the mountains. We are praying for you. The sheer hypocrisy of his sweet words made my stomach physically turn. A year ago, I would have read that brief message and felt a sudden surge of paternal warmth. I would have thought my boys were finally coming around, showing some genuine empathy for their grieving father. Now I knew exactly what that sickening message really meant. It meant the coast was totally clear. It meant they were already calling each other, coordinating their schedules and planning their quiet invasion of my private home. Preston would read that group message and know that his golden opportunity had just presented itself on a silver platter. I locked the screen of my phone and slipped it back into the pocket of my jeans. The hook was securely set. Now I just had to make my physical exit look entirely convincing. I walked down the main staircase and grabbed an old canvas duffel bag from the bottom hall closet. I stuffed a few changes of work clothes, my leather shaving kit, and a couple of thick wool sweaters inside to make it look genuinely full. I carried the heavy bag out the front door and tossed it into the open bed of my heavy-duty Ford truck. I made sure to leave the front porch lights on, giving the large estate the realistic appearance of a temporary holiday vacancy. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the roaring engine. As I rolled down the long gravel driveway, I saw my neighbor, Mrs. Gable, checking her metal mailbox across the street. I rolled down my driver's side window and gave her a wide, exceptionally friendly wave. I yelled out over the engine noise that I was heading up to the cold mountains for a few days of much-needed peace and quiet. She smiled warmly and waved back, completely unaware that she was just permanently cementing my solid alibi. If my deceitful sons checked with the local neighbors, the story would hold up perfectly under any scrutiny. I drove past the heavy iron gates of my private estate and turned onto the main paved county road. I kept my speed remarkably steady, driving exactly the posted speed limit to avoid any unwanted attention. I headed directly north toward the highway that led to the distant mountain retreats, playing the part of the traveling widower perfectly. I drove for exactly 20 miles until I reached the busy center of the next town over. Then I pulled into a crowded grocery store parking lot, waited patiently for the heavy traffic to clear, and took a sharp left turn down a forgotten dirt back road. I navigated the winding, poorly paved roads, circling directly back toward my own property from the complete opposite direction. Just 2 miles from the heavy iron gates of my vast estate sat the Pine View Motel. It was a severely run-down single-story concrete building with faded yellow paint and a flickering neon sign that had not been fully operational since the late 90s. It was the exact kind of place where weary cross-country truckers and transient manual workers rented small rooms by the week. It was completely off the radar of anyone operating in my son's elite, wealthy social circles. I parked my truck around the dark back of the motel, sliding it perfectly between a rusted steel dumpster and a thick row of overgrown evergreen pine trees to keep it entirely hidden from the main street. I walked into the cramped, poorly lit lobby and paid for 3 nights using crisp cash. The night clerk, a tired-looking older man, watching a small static-filled television, did not even bother to ask for my state identification. He simply handed me a heavy brass key, securely attached to a scratched plastic tag bearing the number 12. I walked down the quiet exterior concrete corridor and unlocked the flimsy wooden door to my designated room. The air inside was incredibly stale, smelling faintly of cheap industrial bleach and decades of old cigarette smoke. The basic furnishings consisted of a sagging double bed, a small chipped nightstand, and a scratched laminate desk pushed hard against the far wall. The heavy blackout curtains were permanently drawn tight, thoroughly blocking out the afternoon sunlight. It was a depressing, highly claustrophobic space, but right now, it was my absolute operational command center. I placed my canvas duffel bag on the thin carpeted floor and carried the encrypted laptop over to the scratched laminate desk. I plugged the thick power cord into a loose wall outlet and smoothly flipped the dark screen open. The military-grade software booted up instantly, demanding a complex passphrase that my friend Victor had explicitly provided. I typed it in very carefully. The digital screen flickered twice, and suddenly the grid of high-definition hidden camera feeds illuminated the dark motel room. I sat in the stiff chair. The waiting game had officially begun. I was ready. The hours dragged on with agonizing slowness inside my room. The sun had set, plunging the empty stretch of highway outside my window into absolute darkness. Inside, the only source of illumination was the blue glow of my encrypted laptop screen, reflecting off my face. The room was deathly quiet, save for the occasional rumble of a transport truck on the main road and the persistent drip of the bathroom faucet. I sat perfectly still in a cheap, rigid chair that offered no support for my aging back. My eyes were glued to the grid of high-definition video feeds streaming live from my empty estate. I watched the immaculate kitchen, the grand foyer, and my private study bathed in the eerie grayscale of infrared night vision. Every time a shadow shifted outside my windows, my heart would leap into my throat. But the house remained completely undisturbed. It was an empty, silent fortress. I poured myself a cup of lukewarm, bitter coffee from a thermos I had brought along, the taste grounding me in the miserable reality of my current situation. I was a 73-year-old widower hiding in a motel room, spying on my own home like a paranoid fugitive. The absurdity of it all weighed heavily on my chest. I felt ridiculous. I felt pathetic. The glowing numbers on the bottom right corner of my screen mocked me as they slowly ticked upward. 8 o'clock passed without a single disturbance. 9 o'clock faded into the dark. 10 o'clock arrived, and still nothing happened. The waiting was psychological torture designed to test the limits of my endurance and the strength of my convictions. As the night deepened, a fierce battle waged inside my mind. A desperate, pleading part of my soul began to negotiate with reality. I wanted to be wrong about all of this. I wanted to be a foolish, paranoid old man who was simply losing his grip on reality due to grief. I prayed to whatever higher power was listening that my house would remain empty until Sunday evening. I wanted to believe that the forged medical document Martha had shown me at the bank was just some bizarre misunderstanding with an explanation. I wanted to believe Preston had genuinely come to my house that morning to check on me and that his intense gaze fixed upon Carolyn's desk was just a trick of the winter light. I wanted to believe that my younger son Derek meant every word of his text message wishing me a blessed retreat. My mind drifted back to a time when things were simple and pure. I remembered teaching Preston how to swing a framing hammer when he was 10 years old. I remembered pulling double shifts at the construction site just to afford Derek's expensive baseball camps. I remembered Caroline sitting at our kitchen table helping them sort through college applications, her face glowing with pride. We had given them everything. We sacrificed to ensure they would never know poverty. How could those two bright, smiling boys turn into the cold, calculating men I saw on my phone screen on Thanksgiving Day? The cognitive dissonance was tearing my heart apart. I gripped the edge of the scratched laminate desk until my fingers went numb, silently begging my sons to prove my terrible suspicions wrong. The hands of the clock crawled slowly toward 11. The toll of the stakeout was catching up with me. My eyes burned from staring at the bright screen. A dull headache pulsed at the base of my skull. The stale air of the motel room felt suffocating, but I did not dare open a window for a breath of fresh air. I could not risk looking away from the monitors for even a single second. The quiet inside the motel room was incredibly oppressive, but the silence broadcasting from the sensitive audio receivers hidden inside my estate was completely deafening. It was the distinct sound of a massive home that had lost its soul. I watched the infrared feed of my private study, my eyes locked on the antique cherry wood desk where I had left the power of attorney paperwork. It sat there on the polished surface like a loaded gun, waiting to be fired. Every passing minute that the house remained empty gave me a tiny sliver of renewed hope. Maybe they had decided to wait until morning. Maybe they actually respected my boundaries. Maybe the brutal reality I had meticulously constructed in my head was just a dark manifestation of my profound grief over losing Caroline. I rubbed my exhausted eyes with the heels of my hands, feeling the rough texture of my calloused skin against my heavy eyelids. I was feeling incredibly tired. Not just physically tired, but suffering from a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that reached all the way down into my marrow. I leaned back in the stiff wooden chair and let out a long, shuddering breath. Maybe it was time to close the laptop and end this madness. Maybe it was time to drive back home, tear up those legal papers, and try to have an honest conversation with my boys in the morning. I reached out to shut down the encrypted software and pack up my equipment. My fingers hovered just an inch above the glowing keyboard. And then the absolute unthinkable happened. At exactly 11:30 at night, a sharp, piercing chime erupted from my cellular phone resting on the desk. The motion sensor application had just been triggered. My blood ran cold, turning to solid ice in my veins. My hand froze completely mid-air. I slowly dragged my eyes back to the laptop screen. The live video feed from the grand foyer was no longer empty. The heavy custom-built oak front door of my estate, a door that required a specific restricted security key to open, was slowly swinging inward. I watched in paralyzing horror as 3 distinct figures stepped out of the freezing winter night and crossed the threshold into my private sanctuary. The military-grade infrared cameras captured their faces with terrifying clarity. It was my eldest son, Preston. Following closely behind him was my youngest son, Derek. And trailing closely behind them, shivering slightly from the cold wind, was Preston's elegant wife, Monica. They did not pick a lock to gain entry. They did not break a window to get inside. Preston casually pulled a brass key from the deadbolt, slipped it into his expensive overcoat pocket, and gently pulled the heavy oak door shut behind them. I was completely paralyzed in my rigid chair. I had never given any of them a spare key to the estate. I had personally changed all the locks myself immediately after Caroline passed away, specifically to secure my privacy during my mourning period. They had somehow managed to copy a key entirely without my knowledge. The last fragile fragment of my paternal hope shattered into a million irreparable pieces. They had actually come. I was not a paranoid old man losing his mind. I was a highly valuable target. And the hunt had officially begun right inside my own living room. They stepped fully into the grand foyer, their expensive leather shoes tracking melting snow across the pristine Turkish rug Caroline had spent months searching for. Preston reached out and flipped the heavy brass light switch flooding the entryway with a warm golden glow. He did not hesitate. He did not look around nervously like a man committing a crime. He moved with the relaxed, arrogant swagger of a landlord, inspecting a newly acquired vacant property. Monica followed him, unbuttoning her thick designer wool coat and tossing it casually over the carved mahogany banister of the main staircase, completely ignoring the antique coat rack standing just 2 feet away. Derek brought up the rear, rubbing his hands together to ward off the winter chill, letting out a sharp, booming laugh that the hidden audio receivers picked up with terrifying crystal-clear precision. I sat in the dim, suffocating light of the motel room, my hands gripping the edge of the scratched laminate desk, feeling a profound, sickening violation. They were not treating my home like a place of mourning or respect. They were treating it like a conquered territory. I watched through the high-definition monitor as they moved confidently from the foyer into the main formal living room. Monica did not even glance at the framed family photographs lining the walls. She walked straight over to the antique globe bar cart tucked into the corner near the large bay windows. I felt a sharp, sudden spike of adrenaline as she opened the wooden lid. Resting inside that cart was a specific bottle of 50-year-old Macallan Scotch. It was an incredibly rare $500 bottle that Caroline had bought for me the day I officially stepped down from my contracting business. I had never opened it while she was alive, saving it for a special milestone that we never got to celebrate. After her funeral, I poured myself exactly 1 measure to toast her memory and placed the bottle back inside. It was sacred to me. It was a tangible piece of my history with my wife. Monica reached in, pulled out that heavy crystal bottle, and casually unscrewed the cork. She did not bother looking for a proper tumbler. She grabbed a standard water glass from the kitchen counter and poured herself a massive, generous splash of the amber liquid. She took a long sip, grimaced slightly at the strong burn of the expensive alcohol, and then began to pace around the perimeter of the living room. Her heels clicked loudly against the hardwood floor. Through the sensitive audio feed, I heard every word she spoke. "This place is so incredibly depressing," Monica said, swirling the scotch in her glass as she ran a highly critical eye over the crown molding. "The decor is completely dated. It feels like a museum for dead people. Look at these heavy velvet curtains and all this dark cherry wood. It is entirely suffocating. If we want to get top dollar from a luxury buyer, we are going to have to gut this entire floor. We need to tear down that dividing wall, rip out these musty old carpets, and put in something modern. White marble minimalist fixtures. Right now, it just smells like old age and stale tobacco." She took another careless sip of my treasured scotch, oblivious to the fact that the man who had paid for the very roof over her head was currently listening to her tear his entire life apart. I stared at the screen, my jaw locked so tight my teeth ached. This was the house I had painstakingly designed. Every piece of trim, every specific shade of paint, every piece of furniture had been chosen by Caroline to make this massive space feel like a warm, inviting home for our family. And in less than 3 minutes, my elegant daughter-in-law had reduced decades of our love and careful planning to a massive, inconvenient renovation project. While Monica critiqued the architecture, Derek wandered over to the solid oak console table near the front door. This was the spot where I normally kept my reading glasses, my truck keys, and my daily stack of mail. I watched the screen as Derek casually picked up a thick stack of my personal correspondence. There was no hesitation. no basic respect for boundaries. He simply grabbed the envelopes and began tearing them open one by one. He rifled through my utility bills, my bank statements, and a few holiday cards sent by my old colleagues from the construction industry. He tossed the discarded envelopes onto the floor like garbage, chuckling under his breath as he read the private financial numbers printed on the statements. "Look at this," Derek laughed loudly, holding up a statement from my primary checking account. "The old man is sitting on a mountain of liquid cash in this account alone, and he is still using a local community bank like it is 1995. He probably still balances his checkbook with a pencil." He tossed the paper onto the table and leaned back against the wall, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked over at his brother, who was quietly taking off his leather gloves. "Preston, I am telling you we cannot wait another month to push this through," Derek said, his tone suddenly shifting from amused to urgent. "My creditors are breathing down my neck. They are threatening to freeze my personal accounts by Friday if I do not show proof of substantial incoming funds. We need to move on a munch on this estate immediately." Preston remained perfectly calm. He walked over to the console table, gently taking the ripped mail out of Derek's hands and stacking it back into a somewhat neat pile. "You need to relax, Derek." Preston commanded, his voice cold, steady, and entirely devoid of any emotion. "The timeline is already set. Everything is perfectly in motion. You just need to hold your nerve for a few more days." Derek let out a harsh, sarcastic scoff, running a hand over his face in frustration. "Hold my nerve. Easy for you to say, Preston. You are not the one getting threatening phone calls at 2 in the morning. I just want to know when we are getting paid." Preston looked at his brother, a terrifyingly blank expression settling over his features. The audio receiver caught the chilling, absolute certainty in his words. "As soon as the judge signs the conservatorship on Monday, we are putting this dump on the market. We will have a bridge loan secured against the property value by Wednesday afternoon. You will have your money to pay off your gambling debts, and I will have my capital to handle my corporate audit. The old man will be safely secured in the memory care facility by Tuesday morning. He will be so heavily medicated to manage his aggressive outbursts, he will not even know what day it is, let alone realize we have liquidated his entire life." The terrifying precision of their wicked strategy echoed loudly inside my small motel room. They were fully ready to forcefully drug me and casually steal my own beautiful home. I watched the glowing infrared screen as Monica finally set down my desecrated crystal glass on the pristine marble coffee table, not even bothering to use a coaster. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and gestured toward the long hallway. Preston nodded, his face a mask of cold determination. He reached into the deep pockets of his expensive wool overcoat and pulled out a pair of heavy black leather work gloves. Derek followed closely behind him, his earlier confident swagger now completely replaced by a nervous, twitchy energy. They moved precisely toward my private study, the absolute heart of my estate. The camera I had hidden inside the spine of the thick encyclopedia on the bookshelf captured them walking through the double oak doors. Preston did not waste a single second looking at the antique furniture or the framed family portraits lining the walls. He walked straight up to the large, beautiful seascape painting that hung perfectly centered over the mahogany credenza. He grabbed the ornate gold frame with both hands and violently ripped it off the wall, tossing it carelessly onto the floor. The heavy frame hit the hardwood with a loud, sickening crack, shattering the glass and tearing the canvas. Behind where the painting had hung sat my heavy steel wall safe. It was an older commercial-grade model, the kind I used to install in the offices of high-end clients decades ago. It required a highly complex 6-digit numerical combination to open. Preston did not even bother looking at the spinning dial. He unzipped a dark canvas tool bag he had slung over his broad shoulder. He pulled out a heavy steel crowbar and a massive cordless industrial power drill equipped with a titanium-coated bit. The microphone under Caroline's desk picked up the high-pitched, whining scream of the industrial drill as Preston drove the titanium bit directly into the reinforced steel housing surrounding the locking mechanism. Sparks flew in bright, jagged arcs across the dark room. He was not trying to be stealthy or subtle anymore. He was brutally tearing my private sanctuary apart. He jammed the heavy steel crowbar into the newly drilled hole and threw his entire body weight against the long iron handle. The thick metal groaned and shrieked under the immense pressure. I sat frozen in my cheap motel chair, watching my eldest son physically destroy the protective barrier I had built to safeguard our family's most sensitive documents. The sheer violence of his actions was absolutely terrifying. He was attacking that safe like a man possessed by a demon. Derek began pacing frantically back and forth across the Persian rug, chewing nervously on his thumbnail. His eyes darted wildly around the dark study. He looked like a cornered rat. "Preston, what if the money is not in there?" Derek demanded, his voice cracking with a high, hysterical pitch. "What if the old man moved it?" Preston grunted loudly, throwing his weight against the crowbar again. The thick steel hinges began to buckle and warp. "Shut up, Derek. The $2 million policy is in this safe. I saw the premium renewal notices on his desk last month. It is fully matured liquid cash value. We just need the original bearer bonds and the policy documents to leverage the bridge loan on Monday." Derek stopped pacing and ran his shaking hands through his thinning hair. "If that $2 million is not in there, I am a completely dead man, Preston. You do not understand these people. My bookies are not just sending angry collection letters anymore. They know where I live. They know where my kids go to school. They are threatening to break my legs by Friday if I do not hand over $400,000 in pure cash." Preston stopped drilling for a fraction of a second, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of his leather glove. He turned and glared at his younger brother with absolute undisguised contempt. "You think you are the only one drowning in the deep end, Derek? My corporate audit is next Thursday. If I do not put $800,000 back into my firm's escrow account, before the federal auditors arrive, I am going to federal prison for wire fraud and criminal embezzlement. We are both out of time. This estate is our only way out." "Grab that flashlight and hold it steady." The heavy realization hit me with the devastating force of a freight train. I leaned back in the creaking motel chair, the cold, stale air suddenly trapped in my lungs. This was not just a case of simple casual greed. This was not just a selfish desire for a slightly bigger house or a newer luxury car. They were desperate, trapped, and completely cornered animals. Preston had been systematically embezzling a massive fortune from his own prestigious contracting firm, moving funds to cover his lavish, unsustainable lifestyle. Derek had gambled away his entire future, racking up a catastrophic, life-threatening debt with violent, dangerous criminals. They had systematically burned their own lives to the ground, and now they were trying to use my life savings to extinguish the massive flames. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding a furious rhythm against my ribs. The puzzle pieces finally snapped together to form a perfectly horrifying picture. The sudden, intense interest in my mental health. The forged medical documents declaring me incompetent. The frantic push for a broad power of attorney. The ruthless plan to lock me away in a secure, padded memory care facility. None of it was born from a twisted sense of misguided love or even ordinary impatience for an inheritance. It was pure, unadulterated self-preservation. They were facing total financial and personal ruin, and I was simply the collateral damage they had chosen to sacrifice. They needed my estate to pay off the dangerous criminals and the federal auditors. They needed to erase me from the equation completely so they could drain every single drop of my accumulated wealth without any legal interference. The screech of tearing metal pulled my attention back to the live video feed. Preston threw his entire weight onto the steel crowbar one final time. With a loud snapping sound that echoed sharply through the quiet house, the heavy steel door of the safe violently broke free from its severely warped hinges and swung wide open. Derek lunged forward almost instantly, shining the bright beam of his tactical flashlight directly into the dark interior cavity of the vault. Preston dropped the heavy crowbar onto the floor, the metal clattering loudly against the hardwood. He shoved his gloved hands into the safe, frantically pulling out thick stacks of paper leather-bound ledgers and small velvet jewelry boxes. He tossed them all carelessly onto the cold hardwood floor, searching incredibly desperately, for the specific financial documents that would ultimately save him from spending the rest of his pathetic life locked inside a cold, dark federal prison. I sat in the dark motel room, completely silent, a sense of absolute calm washing over my exhausted body. They were tearing my history apart. Preston dropped to his knees on the Persian rug, his hands furiously sorting through the scattered contents of the breached wall safe. He pushed aside bundles of old tax returns and leather-bound ledgers, his breathing heavy and fast. I watched the glowing infrared feed as he frantically tossed aside the small velvet boxes containing Carolyn's heirloom jewelry. He did not care about the immense sentimental value of those irreplaceable pieces. He was solely searching for the primary prize. Finally, his gloved fingers grasped a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with a heavy wax stamp. He ripped the thick paper open with animalistic urgency. A triumphant, breathless laugh escaped his lips as he pulled out the crisp, formal documents. He held the pages up to the bright beam of the tactical flashlight. "I have got it," Preston announced, his voice trembling with a mixture of sheer relief and greedy exhilaration. "The $2 million life insurance policy is right here. The original bearer bonds are tucked inside the back pocket of the folder. We are completely saved from absolute financial ruin." Derek let out a massive sigh, leaning his sweaty forehead against the cool cherry wood of the heavy bookcase. He closed his eyes, his entire body going completely limp with the sudden release of tension. "Thank God," Derek whispered. "I genuinely thought the old man had outsmarted us and hidden it somewhere else. We can call the broker first thing on Monday morning and secure the bridge loan against these massive liquid assets. I need that $400,000 wired directly into my untraceable offshore account by Tuesday afternoon." Preston stood up slowly, clutching the valuable documents tightly against his chest. He looked at his younger brother with a cold, calculating stare. "You will get your designated share, Derek. You will get exactly what you need to pay off your violent bookies and not a single penny more. The remaining $1.6 million is going straight into my corporate escrow account to cover the missing funds before the federal auditors arrive at my business." Derek abruptly pushed himself off the wooden bookcase, his eyes narrowing with sudden, intense suspicion. "Wait a minute," Derek said, his voice rising in volume. "That was never the original deal, Preston. We agreed to split the entire estate straight down the middle. $1 million for you and $1 million for me. Just because your massive corporate embezzlement scheme is more expensive to cover up does not mean you get to shortchange my cut of the inheritance. I need extra capital to restart my tech company. $400,000 only covers my immediate gambling debts. It leaves me with absolutely nothing to build a new life." Preston let out a harsh, patronizing laugh. "You do not have a life to build, Derek. You are a chronic failure. I am the one taking all the massive legal risks here. I am the one who forged the medical documents declaring the old man incompetent. I am the one who orchestrated this conservatorship strategy. You are just a glorified spectator." Before Derek could shout another desperate demand, Monica stepped out of the dark shadows near the doorway. She walked slowly toward the center of the ruined study, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She crossed her arms over her expensive wool coat and glared at Derek with absolute unfiltered disgust. "You are a pathetic loser, Derek," she stated, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. "You have spent your entire adult life begging your father to bail you out of your stupid, reckless mistakes. Now you are standing here begging my husband to hand you $1 million that you did absolutely nothing to earn. You should be down on your knees, thanking Preston for saving your miserable life. If it were up to me, I would let your violent bookies break both of your legs. It might finally teach you a valuable lesson about financial responsibility. You are completely useless to us." The sheer cruelty of Monica's words hit Derek like a physical blow. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The fear that had been paralyzing him just moments before evaporated, replaced by a sudden, violent fury. He lunged across the Persian rug, closing the distance between himself and his older brother in a single second. He raised both of his hands and shoved Preston violently in the chest. Preston stumbled backward, crashing hard against the edge of the antique mahogany credenza. The heavy flashlight fell from his grip, rolling wildly across the floor and casting chaotic spinning beams of light across the walls. "Do not ever let your wicked wife talk to me like that," Derek screamed, his voice echoing loudly through the silent, empty estate. "You think you are a brilliant mastermind, Preston. You think you are so vastly superior to me. You would not even have this money if I had not helped you." Preston recovered his balance, his face twisted with furious anger. He stepped forward, ready to strike his brother. But Derek did not back down. "I am the one who slipped the heavy sleeping pills into his black coffee on Thanksgiving," Derek shouted, completely losing all remaining sense of caution. "I am the one who made him look terribly disoriented and hopelessly confused in front of the extended family. I created the exact symptoms you needed to justify your fake medical evaluation. If I had not drugged his coffee, your private doctor would never have signed off on the severe dementia diagnosis. You absolutely needed my help to pull off this entire twisted operation. You owe me that full $1 million, Preston. If you try to cut me out of my fair share of the liquid cash, I swear to God I will march straight down to the federal prosecutor's office and tell them exactly how you drained your corporate accounts to buy your ridiculous luxury cars. I will burn your entire fake life to the ground." I sat perfectly motionless in the dark, grimy motel room, the stale air thick around me. I leaned closer to the glowing screen of my encrypted laptop. Every single word of their screaming argument was captured with terrifying precision by the military-grade audio receivers hidden beneath Caroline's antique desk. The hidden cameras recorded their flushed, angry faces in stark infrared detail. They were turning on each other like starving wolves fighting over a fresh carcass. Derek had just handed me the ultimate weapon. The final horrifying piece of the puzzle had been spoken aloud for the permanent digital record. My own son had deliberately poisoned me. He had laced my drink to manufacture the exact symptoms of a deteriorating mind. The temporary confusion I had felt, the terrifying memory lapses that had brought me to tears, it was all a chemically induced manipulation. The profound betrayal momentarily robbed me of my breath, but it was quickly replaced by a cold sense of absolute triumph. They had provided the undeniable proof of their deeply malicious intent. The waiting game was completely and officially over. I finally possessed absolutely everything I needed to completely destroy them both. The air in the motel room grew incredibly thick and suffocating as Derek's confession about the sleeping pills hung in the silent space. I thought the betrayal had reached its absolute bottom, but I was entirely unprepared for the sheer depth of the darkness hiding inside my eldest son. Preston stood frozen for a fraction of a second, his broad shoulders rising and falling, with heavy, ragged breaths. The infrared camera captured the exact moment, his carefully maintained facade completely shattered. The cool, calculating businessman vanished, replaced by a desperate, cornered predator. He dropped the heavy stack of life insurance documents onto the Persian rug. In one swift, explosive movement, he lunged across the narrow space between them. He grabbed Derek by the thick lapels of his winter coat and drove him backward with terrifying force. Derek slammed hard into the solid mahogany bookshelves. The violent impact shook the heavy wooden structure, rattling the antique books and sending a fine layer of dust falling through the beam of the discarded tactical flashlight. Preston pinned his younger brother against the wood, his forearm pressed brutally across Derek's collarbone. The military-grade hidden camera embedded in the adjacent shelf framed Preston's face in flawless high-definition detail. I could see the furious pulse of the vein in his neck. I could see the wild, unhinged glare in his eyes. He leaned in so close to Derek that their noses were nearly touching. The audio receiver caught the raw, guttural sound of his voice, a venomous whisper that slowly escalated into a deranged scream. "Help me." Preston spat, his voice vibrating with absolute malice. "You think dropping a few sleeping pills into a cup of coffee makes you a mastermind, Derek? You think you did the heavy lifting for this family? You have absolutely no idea what I have done to protect us from complete financial ruin. Do you know how hard it was to watch Mom fade away in that bedroom? Do you have any concept of the psychological toll it took on me to sit by her side while you were out losing your inheritance at the blackjack tables? Derek stared back at his brother, his face draining of all color. He struggled to breathe under the crushing weight of Preston's arm. What are you talking about? Derek choked out, his eyes wide with sudden, unadulterated terror. Preston leaned his body weight forward, pressing harder against the mahogany shelves. I am talking about the fact that her heart was perfectly stable. Preston confessed, his words slicing through the silence like a jagged blade. The doctors said her condition was managed. I had to swap her prescribed heart medication with low-dose sedatives for 2 entire months. Every single time I visited her, every single time I brought her a glass of water, I was replacing her life-saving pills with tranquilizers. If I did not speed up her heart failure, she would have lived for another 10 years easily. My corporate audit is next week, Derek. I did not have 10 years to wait for a natural inheritance. That $2 million payout is mine because I got my hands dirty to save us both from spending the rest of our lives in a federal penitentiary. The sheer magnitude of the confession hit the study with the destructive force of a bomb. For a long, agonizing moment, absolutely no one moved. The silence that followed his words was thick, heavy, and completely suffocating. Derek's mouth fell open in silent, paralyzed horror. He was a deeply flawed man, a selfish gambler, and a cowardly cheat, but the realization that his own brother had meticulously orchestrated the cold-blooded murder of their mother completely broke his mind. He went completely limp against the wooden shelves, his eyes completely hollow and vacant. Standing near the doorway, Monica physically recoiled. The heavy crystal Scotch glass slipped from her trembling fingers and shattered violently against the hardwood floor. The expensive amber liquid pooled around her designer shoes, but she did not even look down. She raised both of her shaking hands and covered her mouth, her eyes wide with undisguised shock. She had gleefully participated in the financial theft. She had eagerly helped plan the cruel conservatorship, but she clearly had absolutely no idea that she was married to a calculating murderer. She slowly backed away from her husband, retreating into the dark shadows of the hallway until she bumped into the doorframe. Inside the grimy motel room, the entire world simply ceased to exist. I sat perfectly rigid in the cheap wooden chair, entirely unable to draw a single breath into my burning lungs. The faded yellow walls of the small room began to aggressively close in around me. The dim light from the computer screen blurred and distorted as a wave of absolute paralyzing agony crashed over my body. My chest violently contracted, squeezing my heart until I thought it might actually burst inside my ribcage. I tried to gasp for air, but my throat was completely locked tight. My mind violently pulled me backward in time, dragging me through the torturous memories of Caroline's final weeks on Earth. I remembered sitting by her bedside in the dim evening light, holding her fragile hand as she slowly slipped into a deep, unnatural lethargy. I remembered the profound confusion of her dedicated cardiologist, who simply could not understand why her normally resilient heart was failing so rapidly despite the aggressive treatment plan. I remembered Preston sitting in the velvet armchair across the room, offering to fetch her water, playing the role of the devoted, grieving son with flawless precision. He had sat there looking me directly in the eye, comforting me while he systematically poisoned the only woman I had ever loved. He had stolen her from me, robbing us of our final golden years together, simply to balance his fraudulent corporate ledger. A hot, burning tear slid down my cheek, tracing the deep wrinkles of my weathered face. The sorrow that had defined my life for the past 6 months was suddenly completely incinerated. It was instantly replaced by an ancient, terrifying, and all-consuming rage. The kind of pure, concentrated fury that completely overrides human logic and basic biological function. The initial shock slowly faded, leaving behind a cold, crystalline clarity that sharpened my focus to a razor edge. This was no longer a simple defensive operation to protect my financial estate. This was no longer just about exposing a fraudulent conservatorship or saving myself from an involuntary psychiatric facility. I had originally set a clever trap to catch a pair of greedy thieves, but instead I had captured a ruthless, cold-blooded killer. I slowly exhaled the stale air, leaving my lungs in a long, shaky sigh. My hands stopped trembling completely. I reached out and gently touched the cold, digital screen of the encrypted laptop, tracing the infrared outline of my eldest son's face. He had murdered my beautiful wife for a piece of paper. He had desecrated her memory to save his own pathetic life. The legal strategy Victor and I had carefully planned was suddenly entirely insufficient. I was going to completely dismantle their world piece by piece until there was absolutely nothing left but ashes. The sudden violent wave of nausea hit me so hard that I physically doubled over in the cheap wooden chair. The suffocating reality of the confession tore through my stomach like jagged glass. I shoved myself away from the laminate desk. My boots slipped on the thin carpet as I stumbled wildly toward the cramped motel bathroom. I barely reached the stained porcelain sink before my knees completely gave out. I collapsed onto the cold linoleum floor. I gripped the edge of the toilet bowl as my body violently purged everything inside of me. I retched until my throat burned and my stomach violently cramped. I gasped for air between agonizing heaves. The physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the psychological horror fracturing my mind. My wife was dead. She had not slipped away naturally. She had not succumbed to a failing heart like the doctors had sympathetically explained. She had been systematically poisoned by the boy she had brought into this world. My beautiful Caroline had been murdered in her own bed. She was robbed of her golden years simply to balance a fraudulent corporate ledger. I slumped against the peeling yellow wallpaper. I wiped my trembling mouth with the back of my hand. I was entirely unable to stop the violent shaking consuming my limbs. The agonizing memories of her final 2 months crashed down on me with terrifying clarity. I remembered sitting beside her in the dim evening light. I held her fragile hand as she complained about feeling unusually exhausted. I remembered watching Preston walk into her room with a warm and caring smile. He carried a fresh glass of water and the small plastic cup holding her evening medications. I remembered thanking my son for his endless devotion. I was completely blind to the fact that I was watching him administer a lethal dose of tranquilizers to his own mother. The profound guilt of my blindness felt like a heavy iron weight crushing my chest. I had sworn to protect her when we took our vows 50 years ago. I had unknowingly invited her executioner directly into our sanctuary. A low guttural sob ripped its way out of my throat. The sound bounced off the damp bathroom tiles, but the tears did not last long. The burning sorrow that had paralyzed my life for the past 6 months was rapidly evaporating. It was entirely incinerated by an ancient and all-consuming rage. The searing heat of this new fury traveled through my veins. It melted the icy paralysis of my grief and replaced it with a cold and crystalline focus. I forced myself off of the dirty floor. My joints popped loudly as I stood up in the narrow space. I turned on the rusted brass faucet. I splashed freezing water over my flushed face and the back of my neck. The freezing shock grounded me perfectly. It anchored my scattered mind to the immediate present. I grabbed a rough white towel from the crooked rack and slowly patted my face dry. I lifted my heavy head and stared directly into the cracked mirror above the sink. The reflection staring back at me was fundamentally different. The devastated and grieving widower was completely gone. The soft and forgiving father, who had spent months making excuses for his distant sons, had been permanently erased from existence. In his place stood the man who had clawed his way up from absolutely nothing. The ruthless and calculating contractor who had built a massive commercial empire out of raw dirt and heavy steel stood tall. I had spent 40 years crushing vicious competitors. I negotiated with corrupt union bosses and broke men who tried to cheat me out of a single dime. I had buried that aggressive version of myself when I finally retired. I softened my sharp edges to enjoy my peaceful twilight years with Caroline. But Preston had just forced that dangerous man to wake up. He had awakened a relentless monster who would stop at absolutely nothing to to secure absolute justice. I tossed the damp towel onto the stained counter and walked slowly back into the main room. My heavy boots moved with steady and deliberate purpose across the faded floorboards. I stood silently behind the desk. I looked down at the glowing laptop screen. Inside my ruined study, the frantic panic had fully settled in among the intruders. Derek was sitting on the hardwood floor. He was holding his head in his shaking hands. He was completely shattered by the horrifying truth of their mother and her calculated death. Preston was aggressively stuffing the $2 million life insurance policy into his leather briefcase. He entirely ignored his brother and his total psychological collapse. Monica was pacing erratically near the doorway. Her face was pale white. She furiously chewed on her manicured nails in a state of absolute shock. They were disorganized, terrified, and incredibly sloppy. I reached out and rested my calloused hand on the smooth surface of the computer mouse. I carefully navigated the small digital cursor to the top right corner of the encrypted surveillance software. I hovered over the bright red icon boldly labeled Save and Export. I clicked the button twice without a single ounce of hesitation. A bright green progress bar immediately appeared on the center of the screen. It securely transferred the high-definition video and the crystal-clear audio of the murder confession directly to my isolated and heavily encrypted cloud server. The digital lock clicked firmly shut. The undeniable proof of their wicked destruction was now entirely permanent and perfectly safe. I did not feel any sudden urge to call the local police department. I did not want to send a patrol car to the estate to arrest them in the middle of the night. A standard criminal arrest was far too quick and far too clean. It was entirely too merciful for what they had violently done to my beloved Caroline. I wanted them to feel the exact same suffocating terror they had inflicted upon her. I wanted them to believe they had successfully pulled off their brilliant scheme. I wanted them to celebrate their wicked victory only to slowly realize they had walked blindly into an inescapable and perfectly engineered slaughterhouse. I picked up my cellular phone from the scratched laminate desk. I bypassed my standard contact list. I completely ignored the sickening names of my two sons. I carefully dialed the private number for Victor Caldwell. The line rang loudly in the dead silence of the motel room. I stood perfectly still, my cold eyes locked securely on the live video feed of Preston zipping his expensive briefcase shut. Victor answered the call on the third ring. His voice was remarkably sharp despite the incredibly late hour of the night. Richard, Victor said firmly. Tell me you finally have the concrete evidence we desperately need. I gripped the small phone tightly. My voice was entirely devoid of any warmth. There was no hesitation or any mercy whatsoever. I have absolutely everything we need, Victor. Preston deliberately murdered Caroline, and he confessed to the entire brutal thing on tape. We will completely bury them. The morning sun broke through the heavy gray winter clouds, casting long, harsh shadows across the cracked asphalt of the motel parking lot. It was Sunday. I packed my canvas duffel bag and secured my encrypted laptop with mechanical precision. I did not feel exhausted anymore. The bone-deep weariness that had plagued me for the last 6 months had been completely eradicated, replaced by a cold, humming energy that vibrated in my chest. I walked out of the stale, depressing room without looking back, leaving the ghosts of my grief completely behind me. I tossed my heavy bag into the back of my truck and climbed behind the steering wheel. The drive into the city was a blur of bare trees and empty weekend roads. My mind was perfectly organized, categorized into tactical steps, just like a massive commercial demolition project. I parked in front of the imposing brick facade of the state police headquarters. Victor Caldwell was already standing on the concrete steps, waiting for me. He wore a sharp charcoal-tailored suit, holding his sleek leather briefcase, looking every bit the ruthless legal predator I needed him to be. He did not offer any empty condolences or pitying looks. He simply nodded his head, his eyes analyzing my steady composure. We walked through the heavy glass doors together, stepping into the sterile, fluorescent-lit lobby of the precinct. Victor had already pulled the necessary strings to bypass the front desk bureaucracy. We were immediately escorted down a long, quiet corridor and ushered into an isolated interrogation room. 2 senior detectives were waiting for us. Detective Miller was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a deeply lined face, and Detective Vance was a sharp, intense woman whose eyes missed absolutely nothing. They offered polite, professional handshakes, but their demeanor was strictly business. I sat down at the cold aluminum table and placed my encrypted flash drive directly in the center. I did not waste any time with introductions or dramatic prefaces. I looked directly at Detective Miller and told him that this drive contained indisputable proof of corporate embezzlement, criminal conspiracy, and the premeditated murder of my wife, Caroline Gallagher. The room went entirely still. Detective Vance took the small drive, plugged it into her secure department laptop, and pressed play. Victor and I sat in total silence as the 2 seasoned investigators watched the high-definition infrared footage. They watched Preston brutally pry open my wall safe with a heavy steel crowbar. They listened to Derek frantically scream about his life-threatening gambling debts and his desperate need for $400,000 to pay off violent bookies. They heard Preston coldly admit to draining his corporate escrow accounts, and then the ultimate horror filled the small room. The audio feed crackled with Preston's deranged, screaming confession. They listened as he explicitly detailed how he had systematically swapped his own mother's vital heart medication for low-dose sedatives over the course of 2 months to artificially induce fatal heart failure. I watched the color completely drain from Detective Vance's face. Detective Miller clenched his jaw so tightly that the muscles bulged under his skin. When the video finally concluded, a thick, suffocating silence hung heavily in the interrogation room. These were veteran police officers who had spent decades dealing with the darkest elements of human nature, but the sheer calculating cruelty of a son slowly poisoning his mother to cover his corporate fraud had profoundly rattled them. Detective Miller slammed his notebook shut and stood up abruptly. His chair scraped loudly against the linoleum floor. He reached for his radio clipped to his thick leather belt. "We are dispatching multiple tactical units to their respective residences right now, Mr. Gallagher," he stated with absolute grim authority. "We have enough probable cause to arrest Preston for first-degree murder and corporate fraud, and Derek for conspiracy and grand larceny. We will have them both in handcuffs and sitting in holding cells before noon." Victor began to nod in agreement, ready to initiate the legal barrage. But I reached out and slammed my heavy, calloused hand flat against the aluminum table. The loud crack echoed like a gunshot, instantly freezing the room. I stared up at the 2 detectives. I did not blink. I did not waver for a single second. I felt exactly like the ruthless contractor I used to be, staring down corrupt adversaries who thought they held the upper hand. "No," I said, my voice echoing with a dead shark-like emptiness that made both detectives pause. "You are not going to arrest them in their homes on a Sunday morning. You are not going to give them the luxury of hiding behind closed doors or calling their expensive corporate defense attorneys from the comfort of their own living rooms." Detective Vance frowned, leaning forward with a cautious expression. "Mr. Gallagher, they are a severe flight risk now that they have those stolen bearer bonds. We cannot allow them time to launder those funds or attempt to run." I shook my head, my eyes completely locked onto hers. "They are not going to run, Detective. They think they have already won the entire war. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, they are coming back to my estate. They are bringing that fraudulent private doctor who signed the fake dementia evaluation. They are bringing a notary. They are coming to legally commit me to a locked asylum and execute their wicked conservatorship in broad daylight. They want to strip me of my humanity in my own house." I leaned forward, letting the sheer gravity of my cold rage fill the small room. Let them walk through my front door. Let them step into my grand foyer completely confident that they have finally defeated me. I want them to bring their fake doctor and their fraudulent paperwork directly into my living room. And when they look me in the eye to deliver their final killing blow, I want their entire world to violently collapse around them. Victor looked at me, a faint, deeply respectful smile touching the corners of his mouth. He turned to the two detectives. "My client is absolutely right," Victor reasoned smoothly. "If you arrest them tomorrow inside his house alongside the fraudulent doctor and the fake legal documents, you catch them actively engaging in a coordinated criminal conspiracy against a vulnerable senior citizen. It compounds the severe charges and entirely prevents them from claiming the video confession was just an exaggerated, heated argument. You get the money, the embezzlers, and the corrupt doctor all in one single inescapable net." Detective Miller looked at Detective Vance. She slowly nodded, a sharp glint of predatory agreement flashing in her eyes. It was a tactically flawless argument. "Very well, Mr. Gallagher," Detective Miller said, pulling his hand away from his police radio. "We will execute the sting operation tomorrow morning. We will have undercover plainclothes officers stationed inside the perimeter of your estate, and heavily armed tactical units, completely locking down the main paved county road. The ultimate trap was set in stone. Tomorrow, my two deceitful sons would confidently walk directly into their own freshly dug graves." Monday morning arrived with a cold, biting frost that coated the sprawling windows of my estate in a thin layer of crystalline ice. It was precisely 9 o'clock. I sat perfectly still in the center of the formal living room, positioned deeply within the familiar embrace of my heavy leather armchair. I was not wearing the comfortable flannel shirts that had defined my wardrobe for the past 6 months of my quiet retirement and profound mourning. Instead, I was dressed in a sharp, immaculately tailored dark charcoal suit, a crisp white dress shirt, and a conservative silk tie. It was the exact same armor I used to wear when walking into a hostile corporate boardroom to decimate a rival contracting firm. My silver hair was neatly combed, and my posture was rigid straight and entirely commanding. The massive house was utterly silent, completely devoid of the usual morning sounds. There was no television playing in the background, and no artificial signs of a frail old man. However, beneath that absolute silence, the estate was practically humming with invisible lethal tension. I knew that two detectives were stationed inside the enclosed security room, adjacent to the guest quarters, monitoring the live surveillance feeds. I knew that highly trained, heavily armed plainclothes tactical officers were positioned inside the pantry, the basement stairwell, and the primary bedroom suite. The trap was flawlessly set, the jaws primed to snap shut with bone-crushing force. I simply had to wait for the prey to confidently stroll into the room. The heavy crunch of expensive tires rolling over the frozen gravel of my long driveway broke the morning stillness. I did not move a single muscle. I did not shift my gaze from the large arched doorway leading directly into the main foyer. A few moments later, the heavy brass latch of the solid oak front door clicked loudly. They had used the spare key I had foolishly entrusted to them years ago. The door swung open, allowing a brief gust of freezing winter air to rush into the warm house. Footsteps echoed sharply against the imported Italian marble tiles of the entryway. They moved with absolute, terrifying confidence. They did not announce themselves or knock respectfully. They simply marched inside, fully believing they were taking rightful ownership of a conquered, defenseless territory. Preston led the pack, wearing a luxurious cashmere overcoat and holding a thick leather portfolio tightly under his arm. Derek followed closely behind him, his eyes darting nervously around the immaculate architecture, clearly sweating despite the freezing temperature outside. Monica stepped inside with a haughty swagger, her sharp designer heels clicking an obnoxious rhythm against the floor. Trailing slightly behind the three of them was a sleazy-looking man I had never seen before. He wore a slightly wrinkled white medical coat over a cheap suit, clutching a silver clipboard to his chest. His posture was inherently deceitful, radiating the slippery, unethical energy of a man who sold his medical credentials. They walked confidently out of the foyer and stepped directly into the center of the formal living room. Preston stopped dead in his tracks the absolute moment he saw me. He had clearly been expecting to find a disheveled, deeply confused, and heavily medicated old man wandering aimlessly in a bathrobe. Instead, he found a sharp, intensely focused corporate titan sitting in a custom-tailored suit, staring back at him with the cold, dead, and utterly merciless eyes of an apex predator. For a fleeting fraction of a second, a shadow of genuine hesitation flickered across my eldest son's face. The unexpected sight of my complete composure briefly short-circuited his carefully rehearsed script. But Preston was a man utterly blinded by his own massive ego and his desperate greed. He quickly shook off his surprise, adjusted the collar of his cashmere coat, and smoothly slipped on the disgusting mask of a deeply concerned and loving child. Dad, Preston said, his voice dripping with a sickeningly sweet, entirely manufactured tone of artificial sympathy. "We brought a doctor. It is time for you to go get some help." I remained perfectly motionless in the heavy leather chair. I did not raise my voice, and I did not show a single ounce of fear or confusion. "Help with what exactly?" "Preston," I asked, my tone remarkably smooth, steady, and entirely devoid of any emotional fluctuation. My voice resonated with the undeniable clarity of a man entirely in control of his mental faculties. Preston let out a heavy, theatrical sigh, exchanging a deeply fake, sorrowful glance with Monica. Monica immediately crossed her arms and shook her head, playing the role of the exhausted, deeply burdened daughter-in-law. "Dad, please do not make this difficult." Preston continued, taking a slow step forward, as if he were approaching a frightened animal. "You have been terribly confused lately. You have been wandering the house, forgetting simple things and acting incredibly aggressively. We cannot safely leave you alone here anymore. You are a severe danger to yourself. We just want to make sure you are properly cared for in a secure medical facility." I slowly shifted my cold gaze away from my deceitful son and locked my eyes directly onto the sleazy man standing nervously in the wrinkled white coat. "And who might you be?" I asked, keeping my tone exceptionally polite but entirely demanding. The man cleared his throat, adjusting his grip on the silver clipboard. He stepped forward, attempting to project an aura of false medical authority. "I am Dr. Harrison, Mr. Gallagher," he stated, his voice incredibly smooth and practiced. "Your family contacted my private practice because they are deeply concerned about your rapid cognitive decline. Based on the extensive behavioral reports provided by your sons and the preliminary evaluation forms we have completed, I am here to execute an involuntary psychiatric hold. It is entirely for your own personal safety and ultimate well-being. We have a comfortable transport vehicle waiting outside to take you to our secure facility." I slowly nodded my head, leaning back deeply into the comfortable leather of my chair. I steepled my fingers together, resting them gently against my chest. "So, Dr. Harrison," I began, dissecting his words with absolute precision. "You are fully prepared to execute a legally binding involuntary medical hold, which will effectively strip me of my fundamental human rights and permanently surrender my massive financial estate to these two men. You are prepared to do all of this without having ever conducted a single face-to-face medical examination with me prior to this exact moment. Is that incredibly unethical procedure customary for your highly lucrative private practice?" The fake doctor visibly stiffened, a flash of genuine panic widening his eyes. He quickly looked over at Preston for reassurance. Preston stepped aggressively in front of the doctor, his fake sympathetic smile completely vanishing. He was rapidly losing his patience, his desperate need to secure the stolen inheritance overriding any remaining sense of caution. "We are not doing this today, Dad," Preston snapped, his voice dropping into a harsh growl. "You are coming with us right now, or we will physically force you into the vehicle." I remained entirely unbothered by my eldest son and his aggressive physical posturing. Preston stood mere inches away from me, his fists clenched tight, his face flushed with the desperate arrogance of a man who believed he held absolute power over my life. The fake psychiatrist shifted his weight nervously from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden escalation of hostility. Monica sneered at me from the center of the Persian rug, her arms crossed defensively, while Derek hovered near the edge of the hallway, practically vibrating with anxious energy. They were completely united in their wicked delusion, fully convinced that they were about to drag me out of my own home and lock me away in a sterile psychiatric ward forever. I did not raise my voice, and I did not attempt to stand up from my heavy leather armchair. Instead, I calmly reached into the interior breast pocket of my tailored charcoal suit, my fingers wrapped around the smooth plastic of a small black remote control. I withdrew my hand and pointed the device directly at the massive television mounted securely above the grand stone fireplace. I pressed the central button with a single deliberate motion. The enormous black screen instantly flared to life, illuminating the formal living room with a harsh, glaring light. The high-definition infrared footage of my desecrated private study began to play. The hidden military-grade camera captured Preston slamming Derek violently against the solid mahogany bookshelves. The room went completely silent as the digital video played, but that silence was immediately shattered by the crystal-clear booming audio of my son and his deranged voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings of my estate. The military-grade receivers had captured every single vicious syllable with absolutely terrifying precision. The recording of Preston filled the room shouting about how he did all the heavy lifting for the family. The audio vibrated through the floorboards as the recorded Preston screamed his horrifying truth. "Do you know how hard it was to watch Mom fade away?" the digital voice spat out with venomous rage. "I had to swap her heart medication with low-dose sedatives for 2 entire months. If I did not speed up her heart failure, she would have lived for another 10 years. That $2 million payout is mine because I got my hands dirty to save us both." The effect of those recorded words was absolutely catastrophic. The sheer psychological impact struck the living room with the devastating force of a runaway freight train. The fraudulent doctor physically recoiled, his eyes wide with unadulterated terror. The heavy silver clipboard slipped entirely from his grasp and crashed loudly onto the hardwood floor, scattering his fake medical evaluation forms everywhere. He suddenly realized he was not just participating in a standard elder abuse scam, but that he was actively standing in the middle of a first-degree murder investigation. Preston stumbled backward, as if he had been physically struck directly in the chest. His jaw dropped completely open, his face draining of all color, until his skin resembled pale, sickly ash. The confident, wealthy corporate executive completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, cornered coward who had just watched his entire fabricated reality violently disintegrate. Monica let out a piercing, blood-curdling scream that tore through the tense air of the living room. She raised both of her shaking hands to cover her face, stumbling backward until she hit the edge of the heavy oak console table. She looked at her husband, with absolute unfiltered horror, finally comprehending the true monster she had married. She had eagerly participated in the financial theft, but she clearly had absolutely no idea that her luxurious lifestyle was directly funded by the cold-blooded murder of her own mother-in-law. The revelation completely broke her. Derek did not scream, and he did not confront his older brother. His raw survival instinct simply took over. He spun around his boots, slipping momentarily on the polished marble tiles, and bolted wildly for the front foyer. He completely abandoned his family in a desperate, pathetic bid for absolute freedom. He never even made it to the brass handle. Before Derek could reach the heavy oak front door, it violently swung open from the outside, crashing hard against the interior wall. Victor Caldwell stepped over the threshold, his dark tailored suit cutting a sharp, intimidating figure against the bright morning light. He looked exactly like the Grim Reaper arriving to collect a long overdue debt. Behind my trusted attorney, 4 heavily armed state police detectives and a highly trained tactical private security team flooded directly into the grand foyer. The overwhelming surge of law enforcement completely swallowed the entryway. 2 massive tactical officers immediately grabbed Derek by his shoulders, slamming him face first. They forcefully kicked his legs apart and violently wrenched his arms behind his back, securing his wrists with thick, heavy steel handcuffs before he could utter a single word of protest. Detective Miller and Detective Vance surged past the struggle in the foyer, marching aggressively into the formal living room, with their weapons drawn and leveled directly at my eldest son. Preston raised his hands in a frantic, trembling gesture of surrender, stammering incoherent excuses, but his pathetic pleas were entirely ignored. Detective Miller crossed the Persian rug in 3 massive strides and tackled Preston forcefully to the ground. The heavy impact knocked the wind completely out of Preston and his lungs. Miller drove his knee directly into the center of Preston and his spine pinning him flat against the intricate woven patterns of the rug. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoed loudly through the room, locking Preston and his wrists tightly together. "You are under arrest," Detective Miller barked, his deep voice carrying absolute authority. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You are being charged with first-degree murder, severe corporate fraud, and aggravated elder abuse." Monica collapsed completely to her knees on the hardwood floor. She sobbed hysterically, the dark mascara running down her pale, terrified face in thick, messy streaks. She crawled desperately toward my leather armchair, her trembling hands reaching out to grab the sharp crease of my tailored suit trousers. "Richard, please," Monica begged, her voice cracking with pathetic, raw desperation. "You have to help us. We did not know about Caroline. We just wanted the money. Please do not let them take us away to a federal prison. I will do absolutely anything you want. Just tell them to stop." I did not offer her a single ounce of sympathy. I slowly stood up from the heavy, comfortable, dark leather armchair. My sharp focus shifted toward the very center of the rug. Preston struggled weakly against the heavy weight of the detective. His face was pressed against the floor, but he managed to twist his neck just enough to look up at me. I leaned forward slightly, looking directly down at the monster. "You were right, Preston. I should stop calling you, and you will definitely never, ever call me again." I turned my back on him. Detective Miller grabbed Preston by his coat and hauled him to his feet. The handcuffs clinked as they marched him out. Officers followed, dragging Monica and Derek through the foyer. I walked slowly behind them onto the porch to watch. The cold winter air whipped across the lawn. The commotion had drawn the entire neighborhood. Doors opened across the street. Families stepped onto their driveways, pulling coats against the cold. They watched in silence as our family was dismantled. Preston was shoved into a police cruiser. He tried to hide his face from the crowd, his ego finally broken. Monica sobbed as an officer guided her into another vehicle. Derek stared at the grass, his spirit broken, knowing he would spend his life in a cell. As officers secured the prisoners, Detective Vance directed investigators toward the silver Porsche parked in my driveway. Preston had purchased it using stolen funds from his embezzlement scheme. Investigators opened the doors and began tearing through the interior. I stood on the porch, wrapping my coat around my shoulders, watching the search. After several minutes, an investigator popped the front trunk. He pulled away the custom carpeting and lifted the heavy panel concealing the deep spare tire compartment. The investigator froze completely. He immediately called out to Detective Miller, his voice incredibly sharp and extremely urgent. Miller walked briskly over to the luxury vehicle, peering down into the hidden cavity. He pulled a pair of blue latex gloves from his heavy jacket pocket and reached carefully into the dark space. When he stood back up, he turned and looked directly at me. "Mr. Gallagher," Detective Miller called out, his deep voice carrying clearly over the idling engines of the police cruisers. "I need you to come down here and identify something for us." I walked slowly down the concrete steps, my heavy winter boots crunching loudly against the frozen gravel. I approached the silver Porsche and stopped directly next to the senior detective. He held up a clear plastic evidence bag for me to inspect. Resting heavily at the bottom of the sterile bag were 4 amber prescription bottles. They were clearly labeled with Caroline and her specific medical information. I stared at the small plastic cylinders, a fresh, overwhelming wave of cold fury washing over my entire mind. They were the original, entirely untampered bottles of her vital, life-saving heart medication. Preston had not simply thrown them away into a random dumpster. The arrogant, sociopathic monster had kept the literal murder weapons secretly hidden inside his expensive luxury car, like some kind of twisted, sick, and boastful trophy. Right next to the stolen pill bottles, the dedicated crime scene investigator had discovered a thick, black leather-bound ledger. Detective Vance carefully flipped through the dense, heavy pages, her sharp eyes scanning the meticulous, handwritten columns of enormous numbers and foreign offshore routing codes. It was the absolute, undeniable physical proof of his massive corporate embezzlement. He had documented every single stolen dollar, entirely convinced that he was far too brilliant to ever be caught by federal auditors. The state police now possessed the ultimate, irrefutable evidence required to bury him. He had provided the exact murder weapons and the undeniable financial motive neatly packaged together in the front trunk of his own stolen car. I looked away from the sealed evidence bag and stared coldly at the state police cruiser where Preston was currently sitting. He was watching me intently through the thick, reinforced glass window. He knew exactly what the investigators had just found. I saw the absolute crushing realization settle deeply into his dark, terrified eyes. He was not just going to lose his stolen wealth and his prestigious corporate position. He was going to lose his entire life. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply turned my back on him and walked slowly back up the concrete stairs, leaving the diligent police officers to finish their incredibly grim work. 6 months later, the warm golden sun of early summer bathed the lush green lawns of the massive estate. The heavy, suffocating darkness of the terrible winter had completely vanished. The criminal justice system had moved with absolute, terrifying speed, deeply fueled by the overwhelming mountain of undeniable physical and digital evidence we had carefully provided. The highly publicized criminal trial was an absolute, undisputed legal bloodbath. Preston and his expensive corporate defense attorneys were completely paralyzed by the high-definition video confession and the stolen medication bottles found hidden directly inside his car. The jury did not hesitate for a single moment. Preston was swiftly convicted of first-degree murder, severe elder abuse, and massive corporate fraud. The judge looked down at him with absolute, unfiltered disgust and sentenced him to life in a federal penitentiary entirely without the possibility of parole. He would die in a cold, concrete box, completely forgotten by the world he had desperately tried to conquer. Derek, facing the undeniable reality of his deep complicity, accepted a heavily structured plea deal. He fully confessed to the conspiracy and the grand larceny, securing a mandatory 15-year prison sentence. Monica, entirely stripped of her stolen wealth and her elite social status, narrowly avoided a long prison sentence by cooperating fully with the federal auditors, but she was left absolutely penniless and entirely disgraced. I stood alone in the center of the circular driveway. The massive estate behind me was completely silent, but this time it was a peaceful, deeply healing silence. I had officially sold the massive property to a lovely young family just 2 weeks prior. The beautiful memories of Caroline were far too deeply woven into the architecture, but I no longer wanted to live in a dark mausoleum. The past had to remain in the past. I had taken the $2 million life insurance payout that Preston had murdered his own mother to steal, and I proudly donated absolutely every single penny of it directly to a national elder care legal defense fund. The massive financial contribution would completely ensure that vulnerable senior citizens across the entire country would have the aggressive, ruthless legal protection they desperately needed to fight back against greedy, predatory relatives. Caroline would have been incredibly proud of that specific decision. I zipped my heavy canvas duffel bag shut and tossed it casually into the passenger seat of my brand-new custom-built recreational vehicle. It was a massive, beautiful machine equipped with absolutely everything I needed for the long, adventurous road ahead. I climbed slowly into the comfortable driver's seat and tightly gripped the smooth leather steering wheel. I took a breath, filling my lungs with the warm summer air. I turned the silver key firmly in the ignition. The powerful engine roared to life with a deep, satisfying hum. I shifted the heavy vehicle into gear and drove slowly down the long gravel driveway, completely leaving the dark, painful nightmare behind me. I turned right onto the open sunlit highway, pointing the massive windshield directly toward the distant, beautiful west coast, finally taking the long, peaceful road trip that Caroline and I had always enthusiastically dreamed of. The hardest truth to accept is that betrayal often comes from those closest to us, the very family we spent our entire lives building and providing for. We are taught to trust our loved ones unconditionally, but this blind faith can sometimes make us invisible to their greed, manipulation, or cruelty. True strength isn't just about being a provider. It's about having the courage to see reality clearly, setting firm boundaries, and walking away from toxicity. Justice and healing begin the moment we stop making excuses for those who hurt us. It is never too late to reclaim your dignity and start over. If you've ever had to make a tough decision to protect your peace and walk away from toxic people, share your experience in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more life-changing stories.